Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This'll be the reading of a one-shot entitled, That Means I Can Adopt Him, right? Here's the summary. Well, wait. You're Vigilante? Izuku asked the man. Interestingly enough, the detective looked embarrassed, while Eraserhead just smiled at Izuku with vindictive glee. Oh, yes. As soon as you came onto the scene, Tsuki here, called dibs. Izuku giggled as he watched the detective try to come up with something to cover up that he had done such a thing. Or, a parental detective finally finds his kid, and Izuku finds his real family. All his life, Izuku Midoriya was never approached in a friendly manner. Too many thought he was creepy with the notebooks he insisted on carrying everywhere, or they were subjected to a sliver of the intelligence the boy had and treated him like a villain. No one knew how exactly he knew people's personal lives as soon as he looked at them. No one knew anything about Midoriya, and that scared them. And as Midoriya learned, with fear comes anger. Izuku on the best of days was treated like a criminal, a villain. On the worst of days he walked back to the warehouse he had been squatting in for the week and treated as burns and cuts. Every once in a while, Izuku will sit in an alleyway, waiting for a hero to see him and save him, but even during these days, he knows he has it better on the streets than he would in the foster care system. So he continued on, refusing to hold on to that silly hope that someone will save him for longer than a couple hours. And Izuku knows that people don't appreciate it when he knows more than them. He knows their responses to anything he has to say are natural. That doesn't mean it won't hurt. Izuku learned how to defend himself, how to use mundane objects as a weapon during these last few years. Being forced onto the streets apparently does that to people. He learned it was safer to explain that his quirk only worked with physical contact. Even if it was the option that got many bullies to leave him alone, it would always hurt to live knowing he couldn't remember the last time he had received positive contact. And he knew how to ride the line between a passing grade and not calling attention to himself for understanding the material. Izuku remembers when his teachers would tell him he was cheating and trying to get special attention he didn't deserve. He remembers how his classmates would laugh and jeer at him. He remembers the excitement in their eyes as he would walk into class, only to be greeted with spider lilies on his desk and news clippings of the person who had committed suicide. He remembers thinking that no one would mourn his death at the age of 7. To get away from school and home, Izuku would spend most of his time at the library, indulging himself in the many textbooks and theory books they had to offer. He also enjoyed going to a beach that was hidden by the amount of trash that was littering the sand. He liked the idea of being useful, even if no one knew it was him who was working on cleaning the area. He loved doing everything he could to help others. He had his nightly run-ins with an older teenager named Dobby, and had slowly gotten him used to the idea of someone caring for him, even if they never saw each other outside of rooftops. Izuku liked helping people, no matter who they were. He had talked too many quirkless kids down from rooftop ledges and bridges to live comfortably within society. He took pleasure in setting up appointments with underground quirkless clinics for the kids and providing them a safe space within the community. The only people he refused to care about were the ones who never saw any wrong with their beliefs or habits. It started a few months after he started living on the streets, when he had been walking back from another rooftop discussion and ran into a group of drunk men surrounding a woman. He remembers vividly what happened, even through the painful haze of red that flooded through him when he watched the men jeer and taunt the woman, and surprisingly, he'd finally accepted his anger, letting it guide him into the alleyway. He had picked up a metal pipe lying on the ground, swinging wildly and spinning throughout the group until they were all knocked unconscious. The woman had thanked him profusely before sprinting away that night. He took a few seconds, or minutes, to calm down, letting that red haze fade away, and sighed to himself while looking around at the perverts that were lying on the ground. He wasn't too worried about his guests waking up any time soon, so he set to work. He smiled to himself as he grabbed their shoelaces and tied them up before sitting down and writing everything he knew about the group, which was a lot. You see, his quirk was a bit intrusive. Izuku could see someone's quirk, occupation, name, and sometimes alias, as well as an overall history of the person. Izuku remembered that night fondly, since this was the first time he'd ever seen his quirk as something useful, and remembered how accomplished he'd felt afterwards. And he noticed how the police department seemed to be appreciative of his efforts. Something he'll learn, years later. was that a particular detective had informed everyone he was off limits because of how much information he provided and how easy he made paperwork for everyone. So, Izuku continued. He helped anyone he could with the cover of the night, a simple mask and a hoodie. He started leaving detailed tips in the office of his favorite detective of criminals and villains he would see during the day. He started noticing that if he dug into someone's history for long enough, he could find the location of the person's base of operations and their home. Izuku took pleasure in the work he was doing. After all, he was just trying to help the community. He slowly started getting better himself. After enrolling himself in online school at the start of middle school, he noticed he began gaining more muscle. He couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, and he started taking care of himself. That was all a few years ago. Currently, Izuku could feel eyes on him before he heard the person. He had just gone grocery shopping and was walking back to his new warehouse when he noticed the attention. Izuku stopped, pretending to feel around for his wallet before groaning and walking back towards the direction of the store and the stalker of his. Izuku fumbled around for his phone, pretending to have a conversation with his mother. He had to pretend it didn't hurt to fake having a conversation with someone who was supposed to love him, since he knew how young he looked. "Hey, Mom," he started, doing his best to sound sheepish. "Sorry, No, I know, but I forgot. Yes, Mama. I promise I'll be home soon. Okay, love you. Bye." Izuku made his way back into the store when he felt the one pair of eyes turn into two. Looking around, he made eye contact with the last people he wanted attention from, Eraserhead and Detective Tsuki. Screaming internally, he ripped his attention away from them, most definitely damning himself further, and walked through the aisles, desperate to lose the men who have been giving him way too much attention. With his head down, he walked around the store until he ran into something. Wait, someone. Fuck. "Sorry," Izuku apologized quickly, bowing low and attempting to retreat before a hand shot out and grabbed his shoulder. He whipped his head up, concerned about others trying to get into his personal space, just to face the detective, and internally felt his patience wither away as soon as he saw who was standing behind him. He was not prepared for this shit to happen. "It's all right, kid. You okay?" Tsuki asked. Izuku stared at him as he felt the detective's history grow within his mind and stepped back, not wanting to intrude on the one parental figure he had. I'm fine, Detective, thanks," Izuku said, and before he could realize how damning that sentence was, Eraserhead spoke. "How'd you know he was a detective, kid?" Izuku felt his face heat up as he said the first thing that came to mind. "Well," Izuku said, gesturing towards Tsuki. "Look at him." He groaned as he processed his words and frantically started apologizing, only to be cut off with laughter from the detective. "It's all right, kid. Well, since you know who I am, do you mind if we get to know who you are?" And sure, the question could have been innocent, but the way Eraserhead leaned in to hear the answer said otherwise. And Izuku, well, he wasn't ready for this. There's a reason he didn't go into the system all those years ago. He wouldn't make it if he had to deal with the hatred and snarls like he used to. He was just beginning to heal mentally. There's no way he would survive, since he'd finally noticed how nice it felt for his head not to be filled with such self-deprecating thoughts. He didn't want to do this, not even from the one man who he's come to think of as a parental figure. He knew the detective meant well, he really did, but he wouldn't be able to see him if he was stuck somewhere and locked in a stranger's house. "I apologize, but I really should get going. It was nice meeting you both." Izuku scurried away, with both men chasing after him, and no matter how long he'd been running through alleyways, Eraserhead was faster, and eventually he was wrapped up in his capture weapon, in the alleyway just outside the store. Izuku laughed a bit as he watched the detective catch up, which made Eraser tighten Izuku's binds. He also supposed he was laughing to avoid crying, because there's no way he'd be allowed to show weakness wherever they'll end up taking him. "All right, kid. Why'd you run?" Eraserhead demanded. Izuku simply cocked his head, eyebrows furrowing in mock confusion. "Why are you two chasing after kids?" he asked, making Eraserhead just sigh while the detective just huffed out a laugh. Izuku smiled internally, grateful that the detective was as kind as ever. "Kid, we just want to know a few things. You match the description of a boy who was reported missing." The detective spoke with surprising softness. Izuku just remained blank-faced before looking at the ground, because he couldn't believe it. Who the hell would be stupid enough to send a detective and a hero after him? "Who reported the missing boy?" Izuku whispered, surprising both of the men. He refused to believe Bakugo would notice he was gone. His mother made it clear she didn't care. And there weren't many others that would be careless enough to report him missing, even if he had missed a meetup. "So, you admit you're the missing boy," Eraserhead prompted, watching Izuku struggle to come to terms with his own emotions. It's not every day that someone notices him or cares about him. He didn't even bother holding back his silent tears as he spoke again. "Who?" he asked again, wincing at how broken his voice sounded. Eraserhead carefully began unraveling the capture weapon off of him as Tsuki spoke. "They introduced themselves as a family friend," he said softly, watching as Izuku went stiff. The tears stopped flowing freely, and he began backing away from the two of them. I'm not... family friend," Izuku hissed, running his hands through his hair, as he forced himself to take normal breaths, completely oblivious to the two panicked men he was pacing in front of, both dropping into crouch positions. He kept pacing, trying to let his legs work so his mind would slow down from the onslaught of emotions he was currently feeling. He didn't want this, and someone had the audacity to call themselves family friends towards him. That's what they're going with now. Wonderful. Izuku's mind whirled with the emotional onslaught as he paced and tried desperately to stave off his incoming panic attack. He couldn't think. Well, he could, but his mind was currently a mess of half-baked escape plans and half-thought-out plans that would let him stay away from foster care. Izuku forced himself to stop pacing and turned to hold eye contact with his favorite detective, praying to every god and deity out there that Tsuki wouldn't throw him into foster care or prison by the end of this. When was I reported missing? Izuku almost winced when he realized he dropped into his informant persona. He had gained a reputation that called him to be ready to demand answers left and right and stop at nothing until he got what he wanted, all because of his height and presumed age. "About a week ago, kid," Tsuki said ever so softly. And God, did Izuku want that? He just wanted someone to care and speak to him like this when he got his migraines or had bad days. He wanted, for once, to be loved and cared for. And sure, Izuku knows he hasn't had much experience with being cared for, but God, did he want Tsuki to keep talking to him like that. And that is probably why Izuku plopped himself down to sit, hands still in hair, and eyes still on his detective, and began talking, despite still flicking his eyes around to look for escape routes and emergency plans while also avoiding looking at the two men, since he didn't want to intrude on their lives. "I've been missing for 4 years now." He watched the detective's eyes widen from his peripheral vision, and Izuku knew the detective hadn't found a lie. "And they haven't been family friends since I was 4. "Okay. Do you mind telling us your name?" Tsuki asked. Izuku basked in the man's comfortable words, head swimming with emotions he didn't know what to do with. "Izuku." He watched as the detective silently prompted him to go on, and Izuku averted his eyes, even further so he wouldn't have to see the man's reaction. "I'm not allowed to use the family name." He heard both of them breathe in sharply. He tightened his hold on his hair before larger and softer hands were carefully extracting them from his hair. He stared in awe and confusion as the detective just continued to rub circles on the back of his hands. "That's fine, Izuku. Thank you for telling us." Tsuki offered a small smile towards Izuku, while he just gaped at them. One part of his mind was basking in the care and attention they were giving him, while another part of his mind hissed at him, telling him that this won't last once they know who he is. "Is that your notebook?" Oh shit. Izuku's eyes widened, and he, painfully, ripped his hands away from the detective before hastily standing up, breathing quickly as his eyes darted around. He couldn't get to the notebook and get out of the alleyway in time. Eraserhead was too fast for that. But he can't leave that notebook. "Whoa. Hey, Izuku," Eraserhead called. "We didn't look through anything. We just wanted to know." Izuku quirked an eyebrow at him, obviously not believing the man, and started pacing again, hands tugging on his hair. "Of course today's the day I go to jail, or prison. Fuck, what if I go to prison? No, Tsuki wouldn't do that. Oh my God, what if this was just an interrogation and I didn't know, and now they know. They could just throw me without having to deal with anyone. Oh my shit. Of course they wouldn't care. Why didn't I remember that? What the fuck?" "Hey, Izuku. You wouldn't go to jail over a notebook, okay?" Tsuki had gotten closer to him and was trying to pace with the boy to get his hands out of his hair. Izuku stopped, almost letting Tsuki run into him, and he just gripped his hair tighter as Tsuki tried to coax him to relax. "Read it," Izuku gritted out, trying to keep the last of his composure, as he watched Eraserhead's eyes widen and look back and forth between Izuku and the notebook. "Tsuki." Oh, great. Here it comes. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut. "I think we just found your kid." Izuku's eyes snapped open as he glared at the hero. "Wait, you're my vigilante? Your roomer?" Tsuki said, walking quickly over to Eraserhead and reading the notebook filled with people's crimes and quirks. If Izuku had to guess, he'd say both men looked equal parts confused and excited. But that couldn't be right because who in their right mind would be excited about this? "Well, wait, you're vigilante?" Izuku asked the men. Interestingly enough, the detective looked embarrassed, while Eraserhead just smiled at Izuku with vindictive glee. "Oh, yes. As soon as you came onto the scene, Tsuki here called dibs." Izuku giggled incredulously as he watched the detective try to come up with something to cover up that he had done such a thing before just deciding to lightly whack the back of Eraserhead's head. The giggles turned into full-blown laughter, and doubled over as he tried to wrap his mind around the detective being as attached to Izuku as he was to the detective. Izuku missed the small smiles the men shared, but he didn't miss the way Tsuki had looked at him when he got up. Izuku watched the detective, trying to find any ill will towards him, any deceit, but Izuku couldn't find it. And as soon as Izuku realized they were serious, he ran at Tsuki, knocking them both over in a desperate and teary-eyed hug. To his surprise, Tsuki just adjusted and hugged Izuku back tighter and glanced at Eraserhead once their laughter had died down. "This means he's mine, right?" Tsuki asked, gaining more laughter and sniffling from Izuku and tightening his arms around the older man's waist. "Tsuki, you know that's not how this works," Eraserhead sighed, letting the fondness he felt towards the two show in his words. Izuku let his mind work once again as the two adults went silent, obviously wondering how to get by their own morals and justify the kidnapping of a young child, and a vigilante at that. "Actually," Izuku started, getting up and pulling out his phone with a smirk, "I think I can fix that." Nervously, Izuku looked back towards his detective. "As long as you're okay with that." Tsuki just smiled and ruffled his hair as he spoke. "Of course. I called dibs after all." Izuku huffed out a little laugh as he nodded and dialed an old friend, putting it on speaker and grinning at a confused Eraserhead. "Why are you looking at me like that, kid?" Eraserhead asked. Izuku just widened his grin as the other picked up the phone. "Rumor," Nezu answered cheerfully. "How are you?" Izuku took no small pleasure in watching both men pale, with their eyes blown open. It was truly Izuku's vindictive side speaking, but he always loved the reactions he got from people once they noticed whose voice his phone was showing off. "Nezu, I wanted to offer my identity in favor of some papers," Izuku said. He began getting worried for Eraserhead, who had only continued to pale. Interesting response, something he will most definitely be looking into later. "Of course. I trust you'll be able to find your way to UA with them." "Oh, I'm sure Tsukuchi and I will find it just fine. Thanks, Nezu." Izuku made eye contact with Eraserhead and smirked impossibly wider. "I can't wait to beat you in chess tomorrow." All three just listened to Nezu cackle over the phone before hanging up. Tsuki just hugged Izuku again and kept muttering something about not knowing how to raise a mini Nezu, while Eraser just started pacing with his hands on his head, but Izuku ignored the two men's antics in favor of hugging his detective back and basking in the warmth of the hug from him. Yeah, there was a lot to explain and deal with, but Izuku couldn't bring himself to care as the three of them began making their way to the school where Izuku's future lay. All right, listeners, this concludes the one-shot. This means I can adopt him, right? Personally, I'm a huge fan of these types of fics. I think the author does a really nice job of writing this out. I'm eager to hear your thoughts and reactions to this one. If you like the fic and you have an opportunity to slide over to AO3 to leave comments or kudos to the original author, I'm sure it's much appreciated. And as always, thank you for your amazing support and for listening.